What can often get triggered is defensiveness, defensive behavior. When someone's in defensive mode, they're not willing to listen at that point. So that's not the time to have the discussion, to develop insight, greater self-awareness, because they've been triggered. To get to the state where they can access their empathy, which I'm sure you know lives in the right brain, it's not living in the left brain. To access that, you don't do that in the moment. You need to step back so that you can make that shift.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Care to Lead podcast. I'm excited to introduce you today to Laura Barker, who is a career and leadership coach with professional designations from the Coactive Training Institute and the International Coaching Federation. When she is not supporting her clients professionally, she enjoys facilitating powerful training. She has trained leaders at Fortune 500 companies as well as professional women's group. And I have to say, this is probably going to be a fun conversation because you have two coactive coaches talking about empathy, and that's like our superpower. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, Laura.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm so excited to be here today to talk about empathy and leadership because I do think this is the key to building leadership in this generation. We talk so much about the technical skills, but at the higher levels, it's not about the technical skills. It's all these we call them soft skills, but they're not. It's these things like empathy that are what draw people in, that give people meaning and help people connect.
I totally agree with you. And I think one of the things people sometimes they can't wrap their arms around is really what is empathy and how does it compare to sympathy?
Mm-hmm. So Brené Brown has a great definition of empathy versus sympathy. And she says, and this is an Atlas of the Heart. I don't know if you're familiar with this one, Cynthia. Yeah, where she says sympathy is the near enemy of empathy. And empathy really is about compassion. It's being with the person. Whereas sympathy, there's a separation. There's a disconnection. Sympathy is oftentimes the person feeling a little bit superior, potentially, to the other person when they're reaching out, and it causes disconnection. There's a different feeling, a different energy associated with sympathy versus empathy.
I agree with that 100%. How do you disagree with Brené Brown, right? Where I have seen leaders struggle is understanding that can it be taught? Like, am I just naturally empathetic, or can you teach me to be more empathetic? And is it sincere? If someone has to teach me to have empathy, is that authentic empathy?
Yeah, I totally hear what you're saying. And I think what's happening within that discussion, you already brought it, the discussion about authenticity. And I think that, of course, it can be taught. Of course. Some people have more of it. Some people have less of it. But to say that we can't develop it is to say we can't grow. Mm-hmm. And all of us have the capacity to grow as long as we have the willingness to do something or try something differently.
So it's interesting that I have a book coming out. I talk about this all the time. People are going to get tired of hearing about it, but it's important in empathy because the book is coming out in the spring, and the book is called Dark Drivers. Mm. And what a dark driver is something that has happened in our past. It could have been a minor thing. It could have been a major trauma. But it happened and it got buried in the back of our subconscious, and it's showing up in our everyday behaviors. Mm-hmm. And it might make us defensive. It might make us not take a chance. It might make us have imposter syndrome. There's a lot of things that are triggers by these dark drivers. So in this book, as I started writing to talk about dark drivers, and I was using client case studies and so on, what clicked for me was when you uncover your own triggers, when you uncover your own dark drivers, you're actually putting your empathy on steroids. Because now when I look at you and I see you behaving in a defensive way, or when I see you being passive aggressive, I don't actually start to think, well, what's wrong with her? Well, she's gaslighting, she's doing this, she's doing that. What's her problem? I start to think, I'll bet there's something that triggered that. And then, not that I'm going to try to be your psychologist, but I'm certainly going to have more compassion. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where authentic empathy comes from. I know I have triggers. I feel them. I know what that's like when someone smacks that emotional sunburn. Now I can see you in that light too. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah. I think what you're saying is that empathy starts with ourselves, that when we feel empathetic, it is much easier to extend that empathy to others.
Absolutely. Now, let's do something fun. We're both coaches, right? And
Yeah.
we're both coactive coaches, which is a very unique and really, I think, awesome kind of coaching. And it's all about powerful questioning. So let's do something that can demonstrate how you, as a coach, might help someone who's struggling with being empathetic. What are some of the questions you might ask?
Hmm. This is really good. This comes up, and it comes up all the time in
Mhm.
coaching. How do I, and they may not use the words empathy, but there are cues. I want to develop more self confidence. I want to be more comfortable in social situations. These are some of the cues. And some of the ways to get there is ultimately through empathy. So some of the questions I might ask might be around, well, what's working for you now? So you start by having them characterize, some of the things that are coming up in their lives right now that are positive. And then you move on to, where are some of the challenges coming up for you? And then helping them, and this is what we do in coactive coaching all the time, is find what that gap is. And it's not for me as the coach to identify that gap. It is to ask the right questions to help the client understand what that gap is between what's working and what's not. And through that action, through that exploration of that gap, you develop empathy.
Very true. And I think like with the dark drivers, when I do work with clients on trying to uncover dark drivers, there's it's a pattern. It's like every time I'm in this situation, I get defensive. I had a client, and I talk about him in the book, who always had to have the last word. A brilliant, brilliant client, PhD, really skyrocketing in his career, but no one wanted to work with him because he could not let something go. Always had to have that last word in. And as we uncovered at patterns, when does this happen? What do you feel? What's going on in your body when you feel this, when you experience this? We traced it back to the fact that he was the youngest of 7 children and he never was hurt. So it was like, he had to stand on chairs and like, you listen to me. And like that still triggers whenever he feels like he's in the least way being dismissed. He goes into this, I have to keep talking. I have to have the last word, whether it's email or anything else. And once he uncovered that and saw that pattern and saw the behavior and traced it there, he was so much more able to manage it. It was amazing.
Mm-hmm. And you know what, Cynthia, what I'm also hearing from that, to build on that, so in coactive, we would call that uncovering saboteurs. Right? The things that come in our way, and they represent negative thinking patterns. And really what's happening here is that client is developing self-awareness, right?
100%. And that's where, and then you hit the nail on the head. That's where empathy comes from. It starts within.
Yeah.
Everything that we do starts within ourselves. So when someone comes to you and says, like, I'm struggling, my year-end review says, I don't have empathy. I'm not being empathetic. Like, I don't get that. That's where you're going to start with them, right? Let's
Yeah.
take a look inside.
Yeah. And the thing is, when we talk about that year-end review, now I'm coming with the hat of 20 years of HR experience. What can often get triggered is defensiveness, defensive behavior, and not wanting to listen to when someone's in defensive mode, they're not willing to listen at that point. So that's not the time to have the discussion, to develop insight, greater self-awareness, because they've been triggered. To get to the state where they can access their empathy, which I'm sure lives in the right brain, it's not living in the left brain. To access that, you don't do that in the moment. You need to step back so that you can make that shift.
Yeah, it's like our rational brain is literally hijacked.
Correct.
At that moment. We are,
Yeah.
and I always liken it to like smacking an emotional sunburn, and it's just like it stings, and we cannot help but react. So there's that moment where Mel Robbins will say like the 5-second rule. Take 5 seconds.
Yeah.
I used to always call it mind the gap, like that. Because there's that gap between the metro and the train in London, right? Mind the gap. And it's that, just take that pause and look down so you don't kill yourself, or, take that pause and breathe. And sometimes that's all it
Mhm.
takes, but it's a
Mhm.
really important pause.
Mhm. And what you're also highlighting there is that difference between reaction and response. When you give yourself that space, you can respond. When you do something immediately, that's a reaction. And sometimes that works. Sometimes you have your hand on the hot stove, it's hot, and you have to react. Like that's the purpose of that pain. But other times, it actually doesn't serve you to go with the very first feeling that you have in response to that hot stove. Or that's not a good example because that's a hot stove and you had to remove it. But I like that visual that you gave there, Cynthia, about minding the gap. I like that.
And one of the things I think also leaders can work on, and I think coaching helps them with this, but noticing triggers in someone else.
Mhm,
We can get in our own world, and we talk about active listening.
mhm,
So, active listening goes deeper than just your words, right? Active listening means I'm going to watch your body language. I'm going to see if you step, even virtually, like you can literally see this virtually. If you say something and the person you're speaking to, like, backs up
mhm,
just ever so slightly, if you're actively listening and genuinely empathetic with that person, you're going to notice. And that might trigger to you to say, oh, something I just said was a trigger for that person.
mhm.
Let's back up.
Yeah. Empathy is more than words.
It absolutely is. It's
It's
more
like
than
words
words.
is the end, actually. The end of you have the feeling of empathy. We feel in our bodies. We feel in our bodies. We're reading body language. And the words are the last part because I'm sure you've seen as a coach, there can often be a disconnect between what someone says and what their body language is saying.
Mhm. Yeah, I notice that in interviews a lot.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
sure you have too.
Yeah.
Um, so let's talk about the empathy if you have a 100% hybrid work environment where people are not connecting face to face, they're not in person. Now, as a coach, I've been doing this since 2011,
Mhm.
and when COVID hit, I was kind of mad that everyone started using Zoom because like
Yeah.
that was my platform. Like, what are you
Mhm.
doing here?
Mhm.
But like, so I've been doing this for a really long time, and I think making connection is something that you can do. But a lot of people are newer to it. So what advice do you have for them?
Are you talking about connecting like via video, like what we're
Right.
doing today?
Yeah, on hybrid work or in virtual work environments.
Yeah, in virtual work environments, well, connection is one of my core values, actually.
Mhm.
It's why I love what I do. And so it starts with the premise that connection doesn't just happen by being with people physically, although I will say it is aided by being with
Right.
people physically. There is something to the energy that's created when people are physically together.
Uh-huh.
That being said, you can create that virtually as well. So, here you and I are talking. We've never met in person. Who knows if we'll ever meet in person? But at the same time, we're reading each other's body language. We're looking at the visuals that are surrounding the screen so that our eyes have a place to rest. And we form connection by asking powerful questions, really. I would do that face to face if I were meeting you, using us as an example. And I can do this virtually.
And can you explain to our listeners what a coach, coactive coach might mean by
Mhm.
saying follow your curiosity?
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think of you've heard that phrase Dorothy Parker says about curiosity?
I don't know that.
Oh, well, she made a comment about curiosity that the cure for boredom is curiosity.
Ah, very
There's no
good.
cure for curiosity. I just thought it was cute. She's so witty. But I think in terms of curiosity, so using powerful questions, a great way to learn about somebody else is to ask open-ended questions. Questions that don't result in a yes or no answer. And the easiest way to teach that is to suggest to people to ask what questions. Because what do you think about X leaves the ball in your court for how you want to respond. And curiosity is listening without an agenda, not waiting for the pause so you can ask the next question, or I'm already thinking about what I want to say next. Curiosity is just sitting back and actually listening with no other agenda but to hear what you have to say.
Oh, well, there's an exercise we do in with executive groups that I think is a lot of fun,
Mm,
and I think it's fun because I'm watching it.
yeah.
But the executives are put together in pairs. They pair up, And then one gets to speak about something, and the other one is not permitted to respond until they've gone 3 levels deeper with
Ah,
questioning.
mhm.
So the first time they do it, they spend their entire time thinking, "What am I gonna ask? What am I gonna ask? What's my next question? What can I ask?" And then I say, "Well, slow down. I don't want you to plan your question. I simply want you to listen and follow your curiosity." And we'll go through this 3 times,
Mhm,
and by the 3rd time, it's phenomenal
mhm.
how much deeper the conversation. That's when they start to understand what it really means to listen.
Yeah. I love that. That's a great idea. And it's similar to something I've used, not within coaching, but actually in HR, which is to ask why 5 times till you get to
Mhm.
the root cause.
And when your kid does that when they're little, you're like, "Stop asking me why."
Yeah.
And now here we are as adults telling executives, "Keep asking why. Keep asking why."
So true. So true. My brother was called Mr. How Come growing up. He had so many
What did he
questions.
grow up to be? I'm curious.
Oh gosh, he's had multiple careers. So it goes to show you that curiosity pays off. He's been a chef. Right now he's working in the construction industry. He's done project management. So bartending. So it's interesting that it's resulted in so many different careers for him.
I was curious if it was going to you were gonna say he was an engineer because he wanted to figure out how everything worked.
Well, our dad was an engineer. So there you go, a
So he probably
mechanical
has that
engineer who
innate.
yes.
So, also as a coach, I'm sure we both do a lot of work with
Mhm,
core values.
yeah.
So, why don't you share with our listeners the importance of, and everybody, I want to clarify that when a person's core values are, they're not just these nice to haves, right?
Mhm,
They're your own personal core values. So sometimes the first level, when you say to somebody, "Well, what are your core values?" They'll say integrity, honesty, and those are great, nice things to
mhm.
have. But why don't you speak to the audience about what real internal core values are about?
Oh, I love this question. I love this question because to me, everything comes back to values.
Mhm.
And in all my coaching, it's actually how I start. In coaching, we call it discovery. I know you know this, Cynthia. Those initial stages, to me, is all about uncovering what your values are. So, what that is what drives you intrinsically and identifying your values. So, integrity, it can feel too high level,
Mhm.
it's too esoteric. But what happens is through asking questions to elicit values from people, and I know you probably know these exercises that you do in coaching, you can get to experiences that people had that help to identify what's important to me. And ultimately, over time, it's those things that are important to you that drive your behavior. And in fact, they're driving it now. Even if you don't have awareness around it,
Right.
those values are driving your behavior. And so within coaching, we're trying to identify what those are. But what people often do is they are extrinsically motivated. And so that keeps them going, particularly the high achievers. It keeps them going for a period of time until they hit that inevitably. They hit some sort of wall and don't know how to move forward. They feel stuck. And
Mhm.
so what that is about is getting back to connecting internally to who they are and what motivates them.
One of the things I obviously learned in my collective coaching was exactly that,
Yeah.
and how what ended up happening for me in learning that was a shift. And part of my work is career coaching. And originally, when I was career coaching, prior to being a coactive coach, I did things pretty much the same way 95% of career coaches out there. Let's look at your resume. Let's see where your
Mhm.
skills can transfer. Let's see what you
Mhm.
can do. And what I would find time and time again was that people would land in new jobs and they would get that next level and they'd be really excited. And 6 months later, they'd say, "Cynthia, I am just still not happy. What is it?" So, what I discovered was that we were missing a piece, right? Because you pick your career when you're 19, 20 years old, and who you are at that point in time and what your values are at that point, what intrinsically motivates you then may not be the same today. So I think it's important to periodically revisit those core values.
Mhm.
I don't think it's one why that lasts forever.
Yeah.
It's possible that COVID changed the internal core values of a lot of people. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that when I think about the coaching that I do, the people that I meet, everything you're saying is resonating with me. So I think in the end, in terms of values, so what you do is the outcome of who you are.
Mhm.
And too often we have it reversed. So we think that the next job is what is going to satisfy us. It's another form of extrinsic motivation, actually.
Mhm.
And so that's why, for me, I think coming back to your values is going to help you over the longer term, because when you align to who you are, then what you do can change and can take many forms. But I think without it, I think that's why there's some people who feel that sense of emptiness because they don't know. They lack that awareness about what they find fulfilling, what gives them meaning and purpose in life. And I really do think ultimately people want to feel that they're living a purposeful life, that they're giving back, and that when they leave, they've left the world a better place.
I think you're 100% right. And I think what happens, especially in a career, when you get stuck,
Mhm.
you start to get into this negative and you think about what I'm unhappy with. What's making me miserable here? What do I hate? Why don't I want to get up? Why do I have the sick feeling in the morning? Until we stop and say, what would make me happy? What is that value? What is driving me? Because it's really what's missing that's driving you,
Mhm.
that inner value
Mhm.
that's making you unhappy. It's not the things you think it is.
Mhm. Yes, yes, yes. Completely agree.
So, in your opinion, what are three character traits that have been most instrumental in your success as a leader and as a coach?
Well, I do think we've already touched on a couple of them, curiosity being one. So I do think that curiosity serves you in so many ways, not just in your career. I think that being curious is what leads to feeling good, to feeling fulfilled. It's about learning and growing. And for me, my curiosity is largely around people. So that's what drives me. I really love knowing how people tick. So that is how I went into HR and how now I've ended up in coaching. It's driven by my curiosity. There's always something new to learn about people. And then the second one would be connection. That's the other thing. And in terms of leadership, a lot of times what I feel is people don't necessarily know. And now I'm combining my HR hat and my coaching hat, that they don't necessarily know how to be part of a team. And people want to feel like they're part of something. They want to feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes companies, what they try to do is with the goal setting, particularly around incentive plans, et cetera, they're trying to create a sense of connection to the company, but it's so much more than that. And connection is what happens between you and I right now. It's what happens in conversations that we have at the water cooler when we're physically there. And it's when we're doing these calls online, but asking those open-ended questions. So those are two of the things that come to mind immediately, curiosity and connection. And then the third, again, we talked about this, was listening.
What advice would you give to a leader who's leading a team that's completely remote? And I have a rule, like you can't have cameras off. Like, it's just when you show up, you have to have cameras on. But suppose you even have that rule. You have cameras on, but you just have one person or maybe two in your group that just seem to zone out. Like they're not obviously on their phone doing something else. They're looking into the camera, they're there, but they're not. And it's different than being physically in the room. What are some suggestions you would have for that team leader?
So, I listened to an interesting podcast, Cynthia, with Adam Grant. It was on meetings. I don't know if you heard it,
No, but I
but
love Adam Grant.
oh, okay, okay. So the couple of the suggestions that I thought were terrific. One was when you're doing an online meeting, instead of making your agenda topics, a list of topics, you make them questions. And simply by reframing your agenda into a question versus a topic, you're already engaging people before they come to the meeting because you're
Mhm.
making them think. You've asked a question, they're thinking what their response is going to be. So that's one way, just to shift as you're entering into the meeting. Another way is to get them involved, particularly, and I'm not trying to single out the couple of people who may be secretly looking at their phones, but getting everybody involved, which means rotating that agenda between the different people. And that way no one sticks out as, having to take the spotlight because everyone takes a turn, but it helps to develop a sense of ownership in terms of what's going on. So those are two suggestions I would make to help to connect team members online.
I know when I have to facilitate online, it's not I like facilitating in person much better, but when I have to facilitate online, I use that popcorn method a lot
Oh, yes.
because
Yes.
they're calling on each other. I'm out of the loop and everybody's kind of has to be ready. It's a little bit harder in a meeting setting to do
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
But definitely if you're facilitating, it's a game changer.
Yes. Yes. I've heard about that, Cynthia. I haven't tried it yet. So it's good to hear. It's good to hear that you use it and it works.
Yeah, it's a great tool because everybody's kind of on their toes and they're thinking and they're acting.
Mhm.
What was it that made you transition from HR into coaching? Because that was a pretty significant decision.
Yeah. I think that I felt with HR, I had kind of reached the end of the line. I knew that I liked it, but when we were talking about values earlier, and it didn't fulfill me the way it used to. I tried big companies, I tried small companies. I've done both HR. And I will say working at a big company, the value is learning structure, how processes work on a large scale. So I'm so grateful for that. But effecting change is hard in a very big company. So I worked in the smaller companies because I felt like I could make more change. And oftentimes there's little structure. So you're going from one extreme to another. But in the end, I still preferred that over time because I felt like I could create the structure and make the changes that I wanted to. And as to why I switched into coaching, when I thought about the elements of HR that I like the most, it is about being with people. And if you've done HR as well, you'll know that a lot of times the day-to-day of HR is process driven. It's about following so many rules. There's so much structure within HR and it's needed. I mean, there's employment laws for a reason, but it can also, at least for me, it felt restrictive over a period of time. And some of the discussions that I wanted to have around leadership, for example, felt as an HR person, felt a little bit hampered. Like I couldn't have some of the conversations that I necessarily wanted to that I can now as a coach.
I think that last point was pretty much exactly why I made that switch, because if you really love coaching
Yeah.
and you're really digging deep with someone and you're really getting to know them, and that trust is so critical.
Yeah.
And no matter how good you are as a coach, there's a lack, I don't want to say a lack of trust, but that full 100%, like I can trust you, can't be there because they know that you're HR and you have an agenda.
Yes.
You have to have an agenda because that is your job.
Yes.
So no matter how talented you are as a coach, there's that line that just stands in the way of going all in. And that was the thing that switched it for me.
Oh, that's so interesting because this is a common path. I'm sure you've seen, Cynthia, as people in HR at some point. When I was studying my coaching, there were a number of people in my training who were HR people moving into coaching.
And a lot of managers go into coaching too. I like companies like Coaches Training Institute because to me, I think the word coaching is thrown around way too casually.
Mhm.
Everyone can hang a shingle out and they're a coach. And there are a lot of consultants. And I do consulting as well. There are a lot of professionals that are helping you get somewhere, but there's a difference between coaching in a specific powerful questioning and so on, and guiding in like, here's what you should be eating and here's how you should be doing it. I'm not like a stickler on that, but I think that people should be really clear on what they're buying for their money, because a health coach is going to give you really good advice. They're going to say, this is your nutrition path. This is what you should be following. And this is going to help you. And we're just going to keep asking you questions. Well, what do you think you should be eating? How does that make you feel?
Yeah.
And they're going to be confused.
Yeah. So how do you, when people are approaching you, how do you clarify for them when you're consulting versus coaching?
When we go into an organization, we wear both hats. And so when I'm working with an executive team and we're saying like, where do you need this organization to go? What are the outcomes you want them to have? And how do we need you to lead in order to get them there? So any advice that I offer from my experience in being in the C-suite and my experience in being on that executive team is consulting. But then when I work with an organization, I usually work the entire executive team at once. So we do group coaching, and then I work with each of them individually. And so they know the difference, because when I'm doing group coaching, it's group coaching. When I'm doing facilitation, it's more the consulting, because we're on a path. And when I'm doing that one-on-one, it's all in coach. And the big key is they need to trust me, because they know that if they're venting about a coworker, that I'm going to have a call with in an hour. And that's where I think that internal coaching doesn't work as well as the kind of coaching that we do externally, because like, if I don't have their trust, I lose all credibility.
Yeah.
So I can never, ever, ever violate that.
Well, ultimately, it all comes down to trust, right? And the way you build trust is through connection.
Absolutely. And like I said, when you're internal, you can't connect as well. And I think leaders, and that's something they need to understand as well. If you're a CEO, you want to have empathy, and I hear leaders all the time tell me, well, I have an open door. My people love working for me and they come. I know that that's probably true. And there's also a part that's like, you're still their boss. And they are still not going to open up to you as much as they'd love them to. They're not going to do it. When I was a VP of HR, we did these 360s, and I was like the coach HR and open door, and I love my job, and I'm here for everybody. We did 360s, and like all of my peers, I did great. But all of the people that were a couple levels down, so I was unapproachable, and I was like, I don't know what I was, stuck up or something. I'm like, what? And it was like, I was completely unaware of how others perceived me based on my position. And, I had to make some changes in that.
Yeah, I have to admit, Cynthia, I'm not a huge fan of 360s. What is the outcome we're looking for with 360s? I don't know that they necessarily serve the person receiving the feedback in the best way.
I think it depends on the kind of 360. I think the old check the boxes like we did back then.
Yeah.
I agree. Today, I do more interview 360s.
Okay.
I do more
That's
open-ended.
yes.
Because I'm looking for data. I'm not looking for like a boilerplate. So that data is really critical to me. And a lot of times when I start working with a new executive, they'll give me the names of like 10 people around them, and I'll have a 45-minute Zoom call with each one of those individuals, and I'll say, I'll just talk to them. Like, tell me what you like. Tell me what's good. Tell me what's bad. And we build this rapport enough that I can really find patterns that every single person loves this person. They think they can grow here, and that they're really receptive to opening and changing and growing too.
I gotcha. Yeah. Yeah.
So it sounds like we're on the same page on that as well.
Yeah, we are. And one thing I wanted to add, Cynthia, when you're talking about consulting versus coaching, is that for me, the easiest way I explain it to the clients is I'll say, when I'm consulting, I'm telling, I'm guiding, I'm telling. And when I'm coaching, I'm asking.
Absolutely. That's very, very good way to put it. Very good way to put it.
Because I think particularly with coaching, the old school, the old style of coaching is much more directive than the way it's practiced today.
Well, it's interesting when I start with a client, they'll get there and they'll be going, okay, what do you have for me today? Like, what's my action item? So I have clients fill out a form. It only takes a couple minutes, but like, this is your time. What are the 3 biggest struggles you're having right now? And where do you need the most support? And it gives us somewhere to go, and they have to think it through and recognize that they have to take ownership, because coaching is only as valuable as the person's willing to put into it.
Oh, yes. Yes. And the other thing that I think sometimes a lot of people don't understand what coaching is or what they're going to get out of it. But I think if people can start with the attitude, I'm willing to see this differently, then they'll get something out of coaching. And a big part of that is up to them, what they take from it. I, as a coach, can't control what you get out of coaching. And that's part of my self-regulation as a coach, is not investing myself in your outcome. But that being said, my job as a coach is to be your cheerleader.
Do you find, well, now not as much, but I don't know how long you've been doing this. I've been doing it for a long time, but I started the business in 2011. And even back then, when people hired me as a coach, they didn't necessarily want people to know. They found out it was like they were struggling with something. It was like remedial. And now it's like, hey, I have a coach. Who's your coach? And now they introduce you and that you got to use my coach.
Yeah.
So now it's much more positive than it was even 10 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The way it is nowadays is most executives have a coach
Mhm.
or have had a coach. Maybe it's not always, but it is so commonplace now that, which I'm thrilled with. I think that's great. But I don't think it was that way. And I really have seen a huge shift, especially with the rise of millennials who are more open to coaching as a generation. And now we have the next generation coming up, the Gen Zs or Gen Zs
Mhm.
coming in.
Yeah, I think that there's a big drive toward the coaching being more positive and the whole attitude around it being more acceptable and I agree. I like that.
Yeah. Hmm.
What kind of strategies or exercises would you give to a leader to just try to enhance their own coaching skills?
Well, to develop their own coaching skills, it starts with themselves.
Mhm.
So, what I would work with initially is developing their own listening skills. It would be working on finding ways to connect with their employees and understanding that it's not about them. I think sometimes leaders, for a variety of reasons, are self-conscious because of where they're situated, either because of the level of their job or because of the visibility, whether they want it or not. Some really love it, some are quite uncomfortable with it. And also, what happens is the higher up you go and the more distance you have between yourself and the people below you, the harder it can be to connect.
Mhm.
Have you seen that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So some of the exercises I would be doing around would be helping them develop insight around their own listening skills, their own listening style, because we all have our own way of listening, and helping them see the different layers of listening to get beyond the literal and to get to what's underneath what someone is saying.
That's great. What if you had to give one piece of advice to I'm curious, I'm trying to decide how I want to ask you this question.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask you two questions
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
to as we wrap up here. But first, I think I'd like to ask you one piece of advice that you would have for a new leader who just maybe got promoted into a VP or EVP level and they just want to hit the ground running. What's one piece of advice you would give to them?
Ask questions.
Very good. I like that. Short and sweet. And then the other one I'd be curious to know, what advice would you give to someone who is considering becoming a coach?
Oh gosh. If I wanted to give advice for someone considering becoming a coach, I would say that, oh gosh, it's such a good question, Cynthia. There's so many directions that we can take with this. I can talk about how fulfilling it is. And for me, so I can't tell people to become a coach. What I can do is talk about my experience and what drove me to become a coach. But in some of the things we've already discussed, but I do think one of the things about being a coach is for me, it gives such a sense of fulfillment.
Mhm.
I love doing it. I love it. And so if someone's considering coaching, I'm not trying to plug a certain model, although I do think coactive is terrific. But that being said, it's more about what often drives it is the desire for insight, for self awareness. That's often where I find the coaching process begins. And when I think of all the other people who studied coaching with me, we were all at that same stage of inquiry, feeling dissatisfied with where we're at and looking for something different, and coaching being one of the ways that they were going to figure that out.
I like that. That's a very, very good response. I know that because working at home for 11 years, and when I come into my study, it's like I'm at work and I get up and my husband's like, "You're so disciplined." I go, "I don't think you understand how much I love what I'm doing."
Yes, that is exactly it. And you know what? My husband says the same thing. He's like, Laura, why are you working on a Saturday? Why are you working on a Sunday? I post my blogs on Sunday, so I have to work, but it's only a short amount of time. But what I'm getting at, it's pleasure for me. This isn't work. I love doing it.
I do too. And we're going to Hawaii in a couple of weeks. Well, not next week. We're leaving for Hawaii. And like my clients know, like I'm in Hawaii and yes, I'm on vacation
Mhm.
and yes, I'm good at boundaries. And yes, but you
Yeah.
know what? I use Marco Polo a lot
Mhm,
with my clients. It's a video app.
mhm.
And so I have no problem if they leave me a Marco Polo and I get a few minutes, I have no problem going on there and responding because I think coaching is a partnership.
Yes.
And
Yes.
your partner can't do that. Well, I'll see you in 2 weeks. Like, yes, they would respect it if I do. And people have never taken advantage of that, like overly, because I work with busy executives. If they have enough time to take advantage of a coach who's willing to be there for them, then there's a bigger problem that they need
Yeah.
coaching for. They're just too busy. But they respect when they need me, they know I'm there.
And you know what it makes me think of is I know we're coming to a close, you talk about coaching as a partnership.
Mhm.
And coming back to empathy and leadership, what I would say is when we are being empathetic and we're connecting with another person, it's because we're being partners with them. We're not trying to be above them. We're trying to meet people where they're at.
Mhm. Absolutely. That was so great. I enjoyed this conversation so much. It's just so nice to talk to someone who is totally on the same exact wavelength. So this is a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Where could our audience, our listeners find you? How would you like them to reach out to you?
They can find me on my website, laurabarkercoaching.com.
Okay. And are you active on LinkedIn? Is that
I
another place
am.
people
I'm
reach out?
very active on LinkedIn. I post regularly 3 to 5 times per week. So please have Laura Barker, please have people look me up and you can find me there.
Okay, excellent. And thank you to our listeners. We appreciate your time. And we hope that you gained some valuable insights from our call today. And remember, leaders who care to lead. For more insights from leaders, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can also find Care to Lead wherever you get your podcast. Thank you so much.